Welcome to Beit Yahweh. As you know, we stand for Yahweh and we stand against all other false religions. Here is an example of some missionaries in history who have gone to reach out to the Islamic world. Raymond Lully had missions to the Mohammedans, and we are going to see what happened a little bit about him. This comes from a book written in the 19th century. Raymond Lully, or Raymond Lully, and the Missions to the Mohammedans. From a recent book on Mohammedanism, we give a few extracts in the hope of calling attention to a subject that somehow or other seems to have less charm for people generally than the conversion of the absolutely pagan portion of the human race. When we remember that about 200 million of our fellow creatures are in the iron grasp of a fearful delusion, believing in a gigantic lie, plotting and scheming to continue the thraldom in which whole nations are held, it is time surely for the Christian Church to arouse herself to her duty in this respect. We may be well assured that if we look with apathy upon the Muslim creed, so does the Muslim himself. Our author says, the zeal of Muslims in proselytizing was not extinguished when they ceased to conquer. The duty of spreading the faith is still made paramount in the education of every Mohammedan. And it is equally incumbent on the governor, the soldier, the merchant, the captain of the ship, and the sheikh or mullah to watch every opportunity of disseminating the doctrines of the Quran. It cannot be without humiliation that we contrast this zeal with the Good morning, son. We contrast this zeal with the culpable apathy of Christians concerning the souls of Mohammedans. Although the first tide of Muslim invasion had been successfully repelled, some of the Saracen settlements continued to exist for centuries in Europe, and the closing conquest of the European Turkey with Constantinople in the 15th century perpetuated the approximation of Christianity and Islam. During the 12 centuries that the Church of Christ stood face to face with her gigantic foe, should we not have expected that many a David would have gone out to meet this blaspheming adversary in the name of the God of the armies of Israel? But how little was attempted in comparison with the magnitude of Christian responsibility. Yet to our shame must we confess that our forefathers did more in darker ages than has been accomplished or even attempted in this generation. We have, for instance, noble relics of the 8th century, and the subsequent ages were not altogether inactive in the work of converting Muslims. These are strong words, but not undeserved. The writer gives us an example of zeal for the conversion of the Muslims in the 13th century, which has been only approached by one later missionary, the lamented Henry Martin. Raymond Lully, to whom the Arabic professorship at Oxford owes its origin, was born of noble parents in 1234 in the capital of Majorca, and when more than 30 years of age conceived a strong desire to proclaim the message of the cross to the Saracens. He became a mendicant, studied Arabic, wrote a controversial work to convince the Muslim doctors, induced the king to found and endow a monastery in Majorca, where 13 Franciscan monks should be trained as missionaries to the Muslims. He then went to Rome to obtain the aid and sanction of Honorius IV, after founding mission schools and colleges on behalf of Muslims in various parts of Europe. Open speech marks. When none cared for this project, he determined to set out himself and attempt alone and single-handed the propagation of the faith among Muslims in Africa. In Tunis, whither he went, he invited the Muslim doctors to a conference and preached Christ. He was imprisoned for his boldness, and at that time was only saved from death by a Muslim counselor reminding his sovereign that a professor of their own faith would be held in high honor if he initiated the self-devotion of the prisoner in propagating their doctrines among the Christians. Open speech mark. When shipwrecked near Pisa, after many years of missionary labors in other parts, though upwards of 70, the ardor of Raymond Lully was unabated. Once, he writes, I was fairly rich, Once I had a wife and children. Once I tasted freely in the pleasures of life. But all these things I gladly resigned that I might spread abroad a knowledge of the truth. I studied Arabic, and several times went forth to preach the gospel to the Saracens. I have been in prisons, I have been scourged. For years I have striven to persuade the princes of Christendom to befriend the common cause of converting the Mohammedans. Now, though old and poor, I do not despair. I am ready, if it be God's will, to persevere unto death. Again he appeals in vain to the Pope, then to the General Council of Vienna, to urge the opening of missionary colleges all over Europe for the conversion of the Muslims. And it was at this council that he at last prevailed, a decree being then passed by which professorships of Oriental languages, especially Arabic, should be founded and endowed in the universities of Paris, Salamanca, and Oxford, and in all cities where the papal court resided. Instead of now reposing upon this success, he was again more active for God. As the needle, he says in his contemplations, naturally turns to the north when it is touched by the magnet, so it is fitting, O Lord, that thy servant should turn to love and praise thee, seeing that out of love to him thou wast willing to endure such grievous pains and sufferings. And preferring to die in the glow of love to his Lord, he in 1314 again sailed for Africa, gathered a little flock of converts at Burgia, where in the following year he was so cruelly treated that he soon after died. Thus a martyr's end was the appropriate conclusion to a life of noble self-denial and perseverance in a glorious cause. It is sad to think that so little immediate fruit of his zeal appeared. The decree of the Council of Vienna to form Arabic professorships remained without effect until Francis I called it into life. The result, however, of these feeble efforts was scarcely perceptible. A few learned works on Arabic language, some translations of Arabic authors, and a couple of commentaries of small value alone remained to testify to the deplorably inert condition of the Church. The continuation. Still, such a life of Raymond Lully's could not be without its influence in stirring up some to endeavour to go and do likewise. Thus we find a monk penetrated the great mosque at Cairo in 1345 to induce the Sultan to become a follower of Christ crucified. Again in 1370, Ethia, the father confessor of the infants of Aragonia, preached Christ to the Muslims. And in 1439, the papal legate Albert of Lausanne, assisted by 2 monks, renewed the attempt, with what success we are not told. In 1540, 2 Capuchin friars attempted to convert the governor of Cairo. We must not omit mention of that mistaken yet honest missionary zeal which, burning for 3 centuries, impelled some of the noblest monarchs of Europe to make the greatest sacrifices in order to rescue the Holy Land from the hands of the Saracens. Christendom was never so deeply aroused by either Jews or Gentiles as it was in the former ages by the Muslims. Primarily excited by the accounts of the persecutions inflicted on the Christian pilgrims by the Saracens, the bare idea of the Holy Land remained in the hands of these infidels could be no longer tolerated. When we reflect on these centuries in which some of the noblest armies went to the then unknown East, and when we remember the personal sacrifices made by these champions of the cross, and the unbounded enthusiasm which turned women into soldiers and pressed children into the ranks of the Crusades, it behooves us to inquire whether the mistaken missionary zeal of darker ages in so hotly contending for the Holy Land, or the apathetic indifference of a self-indulging and self-appreciating age in so feebly contending for the faith, be the more censurable in the sight of God. If Christian Europe in that period of the Church was kindled with so fervent a zeal to reclaim Jerusalem and its sacred places from the power of the Saracens, we naturally look for a corresponding but more spiritual zeal for the Redeemer's kingdom to reclaim the souls of Muslims from the power of Satan. Surely the all-constraining love of our crucified Saviour and quickening presence of our risen Lord cannot prove less powerful to stimulate holy exertion and to prompt self-sacrificing devotion than the interest which attaches to his empty sepulchre. and to the place of his crucifixion.